Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she stacked the last of the dinner plates in the dishwasher. The kitchen clock showed 9:47 p.m., and she could hear the familiar sound of the television blaring from the living room where her husband Marcus sat with his third beer of the evening. Their small apartment felt smaller each day, especially when tension hung in the air like smoke from his cigarettes. She had been working double shifts at the diner downtown for the past 3 months, trying to keep up with their mounting bills. Marcus had lost his construction job 6 weeks ago, and since then, he spent most days on the couch, scrolling through his phone and making empty promises about job interviews that never seemed to materialize. The unemployment checks barely covered their rent, let alone the credit card payments that kept piling up. "Sarah, where's my dinner?" Marcus called from the living room, his voice already carrying that edge she had learned to recognize. It was the tone that meant he was looking for a fight, searching for something to blame for his frustration. "It's in the microwave," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "I left it warming for you 2 hours ago." She heard him mutter something under his breath, followed by the sound of his heavy footsteps approaching the kitchen. Marcus appeared in the doorway, still wearing the same gray t-shirt he had put on 3 days ago. His dark hair was disheveled, and his eyes had that glazed look that came from too much beer and too little sleep. "Why didn't you tell me it was ready?" he demanded, yanking open the microwave door. The plate inside was still warm, but the mashed potatoes had formed a skin on top, and the green beans looked wilted. "I did tell you," Sarah said quietly, continuing to wipe down the counter. "I called you when I got home from my shift." Marcus grabbed the plate and examined the food with disgust. "This looks like garbage. You expect me to eat this?" Sarah turned to face him, feeling the familiar knot forming in her stomach. She had learned over their 3 years of marriage that Marcus's moods could shift like weather, and lately, they had been nothing but storms. "I'm sorry. I can make you something else if you want." "You can make me something else?" Marcus repeated, his voice rising. "I shouldn't have to ask for decent food in my own house. You work at a diner all day. You should know how to cook something that doesn't look like it came from a trash can." The unfairness of his words stung, but Sarah bit back her response. She worked 12-hour shifts serving customers, dealing with difficult people, and cleaning up messes, only to come home to more of the same. But arguing would only make things worse, and she was too tired to fight tonight. "You're right," she said, reaching for the plate. "Let me fix you something fresh." But Marcus pulled the plate away from her reach. "Don't bother now. You've already ruined it." He scraped the entire meal into the garbage disposal with dramatic gestures, making sure she could see every bit of wasted food. "There. Now we're both hungry." Sarah watched $3 worth of groceries disappear down the drain, money she had carefully budgeted from her tip jar. Every dollar mattered when they were behind on utilities and she was skipping lunch most days to save money. "Marcus, I worked hard to make that meal," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Worked hard?" He laughed bitterly. "You call throwing some frozen vegetables and instant potatoes on a plate working hard? My mother could cook a real meal when she was your age." Sarah felt something crack inside her chest. She had been comparing herself to Marcus's mother for years, always falling short of the perfect woman who had supposedly never worked outside the home and had every meal ready precisely at 6 o'clock. Never mind that his mother had lived in a different era, with different financial pressures, and had never had to work 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. "Your mother didn't have to work 60 hours a week to pay the bills," Sarah said, the words escaping before she could stop them. The change in Marcus's expression was immediate. His face darkened, and he stepped closer to her, close enough that she could smell the beer on his breath mixed with stale cigarettes. "What did you just say to me?" Sarah's heart began to race. She knew she had crossed a line, but she was tired of walking on eggshells in her own home. "I said your mother didn't have to work the way I do. She had a husband who brought home a steady paycheck. Are you saying I don't provide for this family?" Marcus's voice was dangerously quiet now, which was somehow worse than when he yelled. When Marcus got quiet, it meant he was truly angry. "That's not what I meant," Sarah said quickly, backing up until she felt the counter behind her. "I just meant that things are different now. We both have to work to make ends meet." "Things are different now," Marcus repeated mockingly. "Yeah, things are different because women today think they know everything, think they can disrespect their husbands and get away with it." Sarah could feel the situation spiraling out of control, but she couldn't seem to stop herself. 3 years of swallowing her words. 3 years of apologizing for things that weren't her fault. 3 years of making excuses for his behavior. It all came bubbling to the surface. "I'm not disrespecting you," she said, her voice stronger now. "I'm just tired of being blamed for everything that goes wrong. I work my ass off to keep us afloat while you sit on that couch feeling sorry for yourself." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus stared at her with an expression she had never seen before. Not just anger, but something cold and calculating. For a moment, Sarah wondered if she had finally pushed him too far. If this was the moment their marriage would finally shatter completely. But then his expression shifted again, and she saw something that made her blood run cold. It wasn't just anger in his eyes. It was hatred. Pure, undiluted hatred, as if she had become everything he despised about his life in that single moment. "You work your ass off?" Marcus said slowly, each word deliberate and sharp. "You think serving coffee and burgers makes you some kind of hero? You think that gives you the right to talk to me like I'm nothing?" Sarah wanted to take back her words, wanted to apologize and smooth things over like she always did. But something had shifted inside her too. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was 3 years of accumulated resentment, or maybe it was just the realization that nothing she did would ever be enough for him. "I think it gives me the right to not be treated like a servant in my own home," she said quietly. Marcus's face flushed red, and Sarah saw his hands clench into fists at his sides. She had seen him angry before, had watched him punch holes in walls and throw things across the room, but he had never directed that violence toward her. Until now, she had believed that line would never be crossed. "You want to see what a servant looks like?" Marcus snarled, taking another step toward her. "I'll show you what happens when servants forget their place." Sarah's fight-or-flight response kicked in, but there was nowhere to run. The kitchen was small and Marcus was blocking the only exit. She pressed herself against the counter, her hands gripping the edge behind her, and tried to make herself as small as possible. But Marcus wasn't finished. 3 months of unemployment, 3 months of feeling useless and emasculated, 3 months of watching his wife go to work every day while he sat at home. It all came pouring out in a torrent of rage that had been building for weeks. "You think you're better than me now, don't you?" he continued, his voice getting louder with each word. "Think because you bring home a few dollars in tips that makes you the man of this house? Think you can talk down to me like I'm some kind of failure?" "Marcus, please," Sarah said, raising her hands in front of her chest in a defensive gesture. "I didn't mean it like that. I'm sorry, okay? I'm just tired." "Sorry?" Marcus laughed again, but there was no humor in it. "You're sorry? You just told me I'm a worthless husband who doesn't provide for his family, and now you think sorry is going to fix it?" Sarah realized that no matter what she said now, it wouldn't matter. Marcus had worked himself up into a rage that had very little to do with her words and everything to do with his own feelings of inadequacy. She had simply become a convenient target for all the frustration and self-hatred he had been carrying around. The rational part of her mind told her to keep quiet, to let him vent his anger until it burned itself out. But the part of her that had been pushed down and silenced for so long refused to stay quiet anymore. "You know what?" she said, straightening up to her full height. "Maybe I am better than this. Maybe I deserve better than coming home from work to be yelled at and blamed for everything wrong in your life." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Sarah saw something flicker across Marcus's face. Surprise, maybe, that she had actually stood up to him. For a brief moment, she thought he might back down, might realize how far this had escalated. Instead, Marcus raised his hand and brought it down hard across her face. The slap echoed through the small kitchen like a gunshot. Sarah's head snapped to the side, and she tasted blood where her teeth had cut the inside of her cheek. The sting spread across her face, hot and sharp, but the emotional impact was even worse than the physical pain. In that moment, everything changed. The Marcus she had married, the man who had once brought her flowers and told her she was the most beautiful woman in the world, was gone. In his place stood a stranger who had just crossed a line they could never uncross. Sarah touched her cheek with trembling fingers, feeling the heat radiating from where his hand had connected. She looked at Marcus, expecting to see remorse or shock at what he had done. Instead, she saw satisfaction, as if striking her had relieved some of the pressure that had been building inside him. "Now do you understand?" Marcus said, his voice eerily calm. "Do you understand what happens when you forget who you're talking to?" Sarah stared at him in disbelief. This was her husband, the man she had promised to love and honor, the man she had shared a bed with for 3 years. And he had just hit her, actually hit her, as if she were nothing more than an object he could break when he was frustrated. Something crystallized in that moment, something that had been building for months without her fully realizing it. Sarah understood that this wasn't really about the dinner or the job, or even their financial problems. This was about power, about Marcus needing to feel like he was in control of something, anything, even if it meant destroying the person who loved him most. But what Marcus didn't understand was that Sarah Martinez hadn't grown up as a victim. She had grown up as the daughter of Maria Martinez, a woman who had raised 3 children alone after her husband abandoned them. Sarah had learned from her mother that sometimes you had to fight for your dignity, even when the odds were against you, especially when the odds were against you. Sarah slowly removed her hand from her cheek and looked Marcus directly in the eyes. For the first time in months, she wasn't afraid of him. She was angry. Really, truly angry, in a way that burned through her exhaustion and fear like sunlight through fog. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," she said quietly. Marcus seemed taken aback by her calm response. He had expected tears, apologies, submission. He had expected her to crumble the way she always did when he raised his voice or threw things. He hadn't expected this cold, steady fury that seemed to radiate from every inch of her small frame. "What are you going to do about it?" Marcus asked, but there was something uncertain in his voice now, as if he was beginning to realize that he may have pushed her past a point of no return. Sarah didn't answer immediately. Instead, she thought about her mother, about the lessons she had learned growing up in a household where weakness was a luxury they couldn't afford. Maria Martinez had taught her daughters that sometimes life would knock you down, but what mattered was how you got back up. And Sarah Martinez was definitely getting back up. The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside their window. Marcus stood there, waiting for her response, probably expecting her to either break down crying or try to leave the room. What he wasn't expecting was for his wife to start moving toward him instead of away from him, but that's exactly what Sarah did. She pushed herself off the counter and took a step forward, closing the distance between them. Marcus instinctively took a step back, confusion replacing the satisfaction on his face. "Sarah, what are you doing?" he asked. And for the first time that evening, there was uncertainty in his voice. Sarah didn't answer. She was thinking about 3 years of walking on eggshells, 3 years of making excuses for his behavior to her family and friends, 3 years of believing that if she just tried harder, loved him better, cooked better meals, and kept a cleaner house, that he would go back to being the man she had fallen in love with. She was thinking about how stupid she had been to believe that love could fix someone who didn't want to be fixed. Most of all, she was thinking about the self-defense classes her mother had insisted she take when she moved out on her own. Classes she had never thought she would need, especially not in her own kitchen, with her own husband. But Marcus had just changed the rules of their relationship forever. And if he wanted to play by new rules, Sarah was prepared to show him exactly what those rules looked like. What happened next would change both of their lives forever, in ways that neither of them could have imagined when they woke up that morning. Because sometimes, when you push someone too far, you discover that they're much stronger than you ever realized. And sometimes, that discovery comes too late to take back what you've done. The moment stretched between them like a taut wire ready to snap. Marcus stared at his wife, trying to process the change he saw in her eyes. Gone was the submissive woman who had been apologizing for everything just minutes ago. In her place stood someone he didn't recognize, someone with steel in her spine and fire in her gaze. "Sarah, I think you need to calm down," Marcus said, but his voice lacked the authority he had wielded just moments before. There was something in her posture, in the way she held herself, that made him take another step backward. Sarah's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Calm down. You just hit me in my own kitchen, and you want me to calm down?" The red mark on her cheek was already beginning to darken, a handprint-shaped bruise that would be purple by morning. But instead of the tears Marcus expected, Instead of the broken sobbing that would have made him feel powerful and in control, Sarah seemed to be gathering strength from her anger. "Look, I didn't mean to hit you that hard," Marcus said, his voice taking on a wheedling tone. You pushed me too far, you know? You said things that hurt." "I pushed you too far?" Sarah repeated, and now she did smile, but it was a cold, dangerous expression that made Marcus's stomach clench with something he didn't want to name. "Marcus, you have no idea what too far looks like." What Marcus didn't know about his wife was that Sarah Martinez had grown up in East Los Angeles, in a neighborhood where showing weakness could get you killed. Her mother Maria hadn't just been a single parent. She had been a woman who worked 3 jobs, still found time to teach her daughters how to protect themselves in a world that wasn't always kind to small Hispanic women. Sarah had spent her teenage years in a dojo above a corner store, learning Krav Maga from an ex-Israeli military instructor named David Chen. Master Chen didn't believe in teaching pretty forms or flashy kicks. He taught practical, brutal efficiency. How to disable an attacker quickly and decisively. How to turn someone's size and strength against them. "The world will try to tell you that you're weak because you're small," Master Chen had told his students, most of whom were women from the neighborhood. "But size doesn't matter when you know where to hit and how to hit hard." Sarah had practiced those lessons for 6 years, until the movements became as natural as breathing. She had sparred with men twice her size and learned how to use their overconfidence against them. She had broken boards with her bare hands and learned to throw punches that could drop a grown man. But she had never thought she would need those skills in her own home against the man she had promised to love and honor. Marcus was still talking, still making excuses, still trying to manipulate the situation back under his control. "You know I love you, baby. I just lost my temper. It won't happen again, I promise." "You're right," Sarah said quietly. "It won't happen again." Something in her tone made Marcus's rambling justifications die in his throat. There was a finality to her words that he didn't like, a certainty that suggested she wasn't planning to forgive and forget the way she always had before. "What do you mean?" he asked. Instead of answering, Sarah began to move. She didn't rush or telegraph her intentions. She simply stepped forward, closing the distance between them with the fluid grace of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Marcus's first instinct was to grab her, to use his size advantage to control the situation the way he had been controlling it for months. He was 6'2" and 200 pounds of muscle built up from years of construction work. Sarah was 5'4" and barely 130 pounds soaking wet. In his mind, there was no contest. He reached out to grab her shoulders, intending to shake some sense into her, to make her understand that he was the one in charge. But Sarah had been waiting for him to make exactly that move. The moment Marcus's hands moved toward her, Sarah's body shifted into a stance Master Chen had drilled into her 1,000 times. Her left foot stepped forward and to the side, her body turning at an angle that made Marcus's grab miss by inches. At the same time, her right hand shot up in a sharp, precise movement that caught Marcus's wrist and bent it backward at an angle that sent lightning bolts of pain up his arm. "What the hell?" Marcus started to say, but the words were cut off as Sarah's other hand found a pressure point just below his elbow. The combination of the wrist lock and the pressure point created a lever system that gave her complete control over his entire arm, despite the difference in their size. Master Chen had called this particular technique small woman's equalizer. It used anatomy and physics instead of brute strength, turning the opponent's own body against them. Applied correctly, it could bring a much larger person to their knees in seconds. Sarah applied it correctly. Marcus found himself being forced down and to the side, his knees buckling as Sarah maintained her grip on his arm. The pain was unlike anything he had ever experienced, not just physical, but humiliating. His wife, his small, supposedly weak wife, was controlling him completely. "Sarah, let go!" he gasped, but she wasn't finished. Master Chen had taught his students that in a real confrontation, you didn't just neutralize the threat, you ended it. Half measures got you hurt or killed. If someone was willing to use violence against you, you had to be willing to use more violence against them. Sarah released Marcus's arm, but only to transition into something worse. As he straightened up, rubbing his wrist and trying to process what had just happened, Sarah's knee came up hard into his solar plexus. The strike drove all the air from his lungs and doubled him over, gasping. But Sarah was just getting started. While Marcus was bent over and struggling to breathe, Sarah grabbed his head with both hands and brought her knee up again, this time toward his face. Marcus managed to get his hands up just in time, but the impact still sent him staggering backward. "You crazy bitch!" Marcus snarled, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. "I'm going to kill you." He pushed himself off the refrigerator and came at her again, but this time Sarah was ready for him. She had seen the real Marcus now, the man who would threaten to kill his own wife when she stood up to him. Any remaining love or loyalty she had felt evaporated in that moment. Marcus swung a wild haymaker at her head, putting all his weight and anger behind it. If it had connected, it would have knocked Sarah unconscious, possibly killed her. But Sarah had spent years learning how to deal with larger, stronger opponents who wanted to hurt her. She ducked under his swing, letting his momentum carry him forward and off balance. As he stumbled past her, Sarah drove her elbow back into his kidneys with surgical precision. Marcus screamed and dropped to one knee, clutching his back. "Stop," he gasped. "Sarah, stop. I'm sorry." But it was too late for apologies. Marcus had shown her who he really was, and Sarah had decided to show him who she really was in return. Master Chen had taught his students about the psychology of violence, about how bullies and abusers operated. "They pick on people they think are weak," he had explained. "They're used to victims who cry and beg and try to run away. They don't know what to do when someone fights back harder than they fight." Sarah grabbed Marcus's hair and yanked his head back, forcing him to look at her. His face was flushed and sweaty, his eyes wide with shock and pain. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He was the man. He was supposed to be the strong one, the one in control. "You want to hit me?" Sarah asked quietly. "You want to show me who's boss?" Marcus tried to grab her wrist, but Sarah twisted away and drove her knee into his ribs. She heard something crack, and Marcus screamed again, clutching his side. "I asked you a question," Sarah said. "Do you want to keep hitting me?" "No," Marcus gasped. "No, I'm sorry. Please stop." But Sarah wasn't interested in his apologies anymore. She was thinking about every time he had made her feel small, every time he had blamed her for his failures, every time she had apologized for things that weren't her fault. She was thinking about the woman she used to be before she met him, strong, confident, unafraid. She was thinking about the woman she was going to be again. Sarah moved around behind Marcus, who was still on his knees clutching his ribs. She wrapped her arm around his throat in a sleeper hold, cutting off the blood flow to his brain. Marcus clawed at her arm, but she had positioned herself perfectly, using her legs to control his body while her arm controlled his consciousness. "Listen to me very carefully," Sarah whispered in his ear. "You're going to pass out in about 10 seconds. When you wake up, I want you to think about what happens to men who hit their wives." Marcus struggled harder, panic setting in as he felt the darkness closing around the edges of his vision. But Sarah held on, counting down the seconds until his body went limp. She released him immediately, letting him slump forward onto the kitchen floor. He wasn't seriously hurt. The sleeper hold was designed to render someone unconscious without causing permanent damage. But when he woke up, he would have a very clear understanding of how helpless he had been. Sarah stood over her unconscious husband, breathing hard and feeling more alive than she had in months. Her face still throbbed where he had hit her, but the pain felt distant now, overshadowed by a sense of power and control she had forgotten she possessed. But she wasn't finished. Not yet. Marcus had threatened to kill her, had shown her that he was willing to escalate their conflict to lethal violence. Master Chen had been very clear about what you did with that kind of threat. If someone shows you they're willing to kill you, he had taught them, you have to make sure they never get the chance to try. Sarah looked around the kitchen, taking inventory of what was available. Her eyes settled on the dish towels hanging by the sink, then moved to the wooden spoons in the ceramic holder on the counter. An idea began to form in her mind, something that would ensure Marcus never raised his hand to her again, something that would make him remember this night for the rest of his life. She began to gather what she needed, working quickly and efficiently. Marcus would wake up soon, and when he did, he was going to discover that hitting Sarah Martinez had been the biggest mistake of his miserable life. Outside, the city continued its nightly rhythm, unaware that in one small kitchen, a woman was taking back her power in the most permanent way possible. the sounds of traffic and distant music drifted through the window, providing a soundtrack for what would become a legend in their neighborhood. Sarah Martinez wasn't a victim anymore. She was something much more dangerous. She was a woman with nothing left to lose. Marcus awakened to the worst pain he had ever experienced in his life. His head was pounding, his ribs ached with every breath, and there was a strange pressure around his wrists that he couldn't immediately identify. As consciousness slowly returned, he tried to move his hands to his face, only to discover that he couldn't. His eyes snapped open in confusion and growing panic. He was lying on the kitchen floor, but something was very wrong. His arms were stretched out to either side of his body, and when he tried to bring them together, they wouldn't move. "What the hell?" Marcus muttered, his voice hoarse. He tried to sit up, but the movement sent shooting pains through his ribs and made his vision blur. As his eyes focused, he looked down at his arms and felt his blood turn to ice. His wrists were bound to the legs of the kitchen table with what looked like dish towels, but they had been tied with a complexity that suggested serious knowledge of knots and restraints. The towels were wrapped multiple times around each wrist and the table legs, creating a system that distributed pressure evenly while making escape impossible. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that his arms were positioned at an unnatural angle, stretched out and slightly behind his body in a way that put tremendous stress on his shoulder joints. Any movement at all sent waves of agony through his entire upper body. "Sarah?" Marcus called out, his voice cracking with fear. "Sarah, what did you do?" He heard footsteps approaching from the living room. And then Sarah appeared in the doorway. She had changed clothes, Marcus noticed with growing alarm. Gone was the tired woman in work clothes who had been doing dishes an hour ago. Now she wore dark jeans and a black t-shirt, and her hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail. She looked like she was dressed for serious work. Most disturbing of all was her expression. There was no anger there anymore, no emotional heat. Instead, Sarah looked at him with the cold, calculating gaze of someone studying a problem that needed to be solved. "You're awake," she said conversationally. "Good. I was starting to worry I might have to throw water on you." "Sarah, untie me right now," Marcus demanded, trying to inject authority into his voice despite his position. "This is insane. Whatever point you think you're making, you've made it. Now let me go." Sarah tilted her head to the side, studying him like a scientist examining an interesting specimen. "Let you go? Marcus, you threatened to kill me 20 minutes ago. You actually said those words. Do you remember that?" Marcus's mind raced as he tried to process the situation. This couldn't be happening. His wife, his small, submissive wife, couldn't possibly have overpowered him and tied him up in their own kitchen. There had to be some explanation, some way this made sense. "Look, I was angry," Marcus said, trying a different approach. "I said things I didn't mean. But this is assault, Sarah. You can't keep me tied up like this. It's illegal." Sarah's laugh was soft and humorless. "Illegal? You mean like hitting your wife is illegal? Like threatening to murder her is illegal?" She walked closer, her footsteps measured and deliberate. "Marcus, I think we're well past worrying about what's legal at this point." She knelt down beside him, close enough that he could smell her shampoo, close enough to see the bruise on her cheek where he had struck her. Up close, Marcus could see something in her eyes that made his stomach clench with genuine terror. This wasn't the woman he had married. This was someone else entirely, someone capable of things he had never imagined. "Sarah, please," Marcus said, abandoning his attempts to sound commanding. "I'm sorry I hit you. I'm sorry I said those things. I was drunk and angry, and I took it out on you. But you've made your point. You've shown me that you can defend yourself. Now please, just untie me and we can talk about this like adults." Sarah reached out and gently touched the bruise on her own cheek, wincing slightly at the tenderness. "Talk about it like adults? Marcus, adults don't hit each other when they're having an argument. Adults don't threaten to kill their spouses when they get their feelings hurt." She stood up and walked over to the counter, where Marcus could see she had laid out several items in a neat row. There were wooden spoons of various sizes, a meat tenderizer, and what looked like his tool belt from the closet. The sight of these ordinary household items arranged so deliberately made Marcus's blood run cold. "What are you planning to do?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah picked up one of the wooden spoons, testing its weight in her hand. I'm planning to make sure you never hit another woman as long as you live. The matter-of-fact way she said it was somehow more terrifying than if she had screamed the words. Marcus began to struggle against his restraints, ignoring the pain in his shoulders and ribs. The dish towels held firm, and his movements only succeeded in tightening the knots. Sarah, listen to me, Marcus said desperately. You're not a violent person. This isn't you. You're kind and gentle and loving. Don't let me turn you into something you're not. Sarah turned to look at him, and for a moment, Marcus thought he saw a flicker of the woman he had married. But then her expression hardened again, and he knew that whatever mercy he might have appealed to was gone. Kind and gentle and loving, Sarah repeated. Is that what you thought you married? A doormat who would take whatever you dished out and always come back for more? She shook her head slowly. Marcus, you never knew me at all. She moved back toward him, the wooden spoon still in her hand. Marcus could see the precise way she moved, the controlled violence in her posture, and he suddenly understood that this wasn't some spontaneous breakdown. This was something his wife had always been capable of, something she had simply chosen not to reveal until now. Where did you learn to fight like that? Marcus asked, genuinely curious despite his terror. My mother made sure all her daughters knew how to defend themselves, Sarah replied. She said the world was full of men who would try to hurt us, and we needed to be ready. Sarah's smile was cold. She was right. Marcus thought about Sarah's mother, Maria Martinez, a small woman who had always intimidated him despite her size. He had attributed it to her personality, her fierce protectiveness of her daughters. Now he wondered what else he had missed about the women in Sarah's family. Look, I get it, Marcus said, trying to keep his voice calm and reasonable. You want me to understand that you're not helpless. Message received. But Sarah, if you hurt me, you're going to go to prison. Is that really what you want? Sarah knelt down beside him again, close enough that he could feel her breath on his face. Marcus, do you really think I'm worried about prison? Do you think I care what happens to me as long as I make sure you never hurt another woman? The complete lack of self-preservation in her voice was the most frightening thing Marcus had ever heard. This wasn't a woman making threats in the heat of anger. This was someone who had made a calculated decision and was prepared to accept the consequences. Please, Marcus whispered. I have a family. I have a mother and sister who depend on me. You should have thought about that before you decided to become a wife-beater, Sarah replied. She positioned herself at his left side and raised the wooden spoon above her head. This is going to hurt, Marcus. It's going to hurt a lot. Marcus opened his mouth to scream, to beg, to promise anything she wanted if she would just stop. But before he could make a sound, Sarah brought the wooden spoon down hard on his left forearm, just above the wrist. The sound of the impact was like a gunshot in the small kitchen. Marcus's scream echoed off the walls, raw and primal and filled with agony. The pain was indescribable, radiating from the point of impact up his entire arm and into his shoulder. But Sarah wasn't finished. She raised the spoon again and brought it down in the same spot, then again and again. Each blow was precise and deliberate, designed to cause maximum damage to the bones in Marcus's forearm. Stop! Marcus screamed between impacts. Please, God, stop. But Sarah continued her methodical assault, her face showing no more emotion than if she were tenderizing meat for dinner. She had moved beyond anger, beyond revenge, into something colder and more purposeful. This wasn't about making Marcus suffer, though he certainly was suffering. This was about permanently altering his ability to hurt other people. After what felt like an eternity but was probably less than a minute, Sarah stopped hitting his left arm and moved to his right side. Marcus was sobbing now, tears and snot streaming down his face as he begged her to stop. Sarah, please, he gasped. I'll do anything. I'll leave. I'll move out. I'll never bother you again. Just please don't break my other arm. Sarah looked down at him with something that might have been pity. Marcus, if I let you go now, what's going to happen? You're going to leave here angry and humiliated. You're going to find another woman, probably someone even smaller and more vulnerable than me. And you're going to take out all your rage on her. She raised the wooden spoon again. I can't let that happen. The assault on his right arm was just as brutal and systematic as the attack on his left. Marcus passed out twice from the pain, only to be awakened by Sarah slapping his face and continuing her work. By the time she was finished, both of his forearms were clearly broken, the bones shattered in multiple places. Marcus lay there whimpering, his arms useless and twisted at unnatural angles. Every breath sent waves of agony through his body, and he could feel shock setting in as his nervous system tried to cope with the trauma. Sarah stood up and looked down at her work with satisfaction. She had been very precise in her targeting, focusing on the forearms rather than the hands or upper arms. The damage would be permanent but not life-threatening, and it would serve as a constant reminder to Marcus of what happened to men who hit women. "You'll live," Sarah said matter-of-factly, "but you'll never be able to use your hands properly again. Every time you try to make a fist, every time you try to grab something, you're going to remember this night." She walked over to the kitchen phone and dialed 911, her voice calm and steady as she reported a domestic violence incident at their address. She told the dispatcher that her husband had attacked her and she had defended herself, and that he needed medical attention for injuries sustained during the altercation. After hanging up, Sarah sat down at the kitchen table and waited for the police to arrive. Marcus continued to moan and whimper on the floor beside her, but she paid him no more attention than she would give to a broken appliance. In the distance, sirens were beginning to wail, growing closer with each passing second. Soon, this chapter of Sarah's life would be over, and she would have to face whatever consequences came next. But she felt no regret, no fear, no uncertainty about what she had done. For the first time in 3 years, Sarah Martinez felt completely at peace with herself, the woman who had apologized for everything, who had made excuses for her husband's behavior, who had believed that love could fix anything. That woman was gone forever. In her place sat someone harder, colder, but infinitely stronger. Someone who would never be a victim again. The first police officer through the door was Sergeant Elena Rodriguez, a 15-year veteran who had seen every type of domestic violence case imaginable. What she found in the Martinez apartment, however, was unlike anything in her experience. Sarah sat calmly at the kitchen table, her hands folded in her lap, looking like she was waiting for a friend to arrive for coffee. On the floor beside her lay Marcus, his arms twisted at unnatural angles, moaning incoherently and going in and out of consciousness from pain and shock. "Ma'am, I'm Sergeant Rodriguez," Elena said, her hand instinctively moving to her weapon as she assessed the scene. "Are you Sarah Martinez?" "Yes," Sarah replied, her voice steady and clear. "I called 911. My husband attacked me, and I defended myself." Elena's eyes moved to the bruise on Sarah's face, then to the improvised restraints still binding Marcus to the table legs, then to the broken wooden spoon lying nearby. She had worked dozens of domestic violence cases, but she had never seen a victim who seemed so completely in control of the situation. "Mrs. Martinez, I need you to step away from your husband while my partner calls for an ambulance," Elena said carefully. "Are you injured anywhere other than your face?" Sarah stood up slowly, her movements calm and deliberate. "No, just the bruise where he hit me. But you should know that his injuries are extensive. I broke both of his arms." The matter-of-fact way Sarah delivered this information made Elena's blood run cold. Most domestic violence victims were hysterical, terrified, confused. Sarah Martinez sounded like she was giving a report to her supervisor at work. Officer Michael Torres entered the kitchen behind Elena, took one look at the scene, and immediately called for paramedics and backup. The smell of fear and violence hung heavy in the air, but the woman sitting at the table seemed utterly unaffected by it. "Mrs. Martinez," Elena said, pulling out her notebook, "I need you to tell me exactly what happened here tonight." Sarah nodded, as if she had been expecting this question and had her answer prepared. "My husband lost his job 6 weeks ago. Since then, he's been drinking heavily and taking his frustrations out on me verbally. Tonight, we had an argument about dinner, and he escalated it by striking me across the face." Elena wrote down the basics, but her attention kept returning to Marcus, who was clearly in desperate need of medical attention. "And then what happened?" "He threatened to kill me," Sarah continued in the same calm tone. "So I defended myself." "Defended yourself how?" Sarah looked Elena directly in the eyes. I used the self-defense training my mother made sure I had. I incapacitated him and then ensured that he would never be able to hurt me or anyone else again. The phrase, ensured that he would never be able to hurt anyone else again, sent chills down Elena's spine. This wasn't self-defense. This was something much more calculated and final. The paramedics arrived within minutes, and Elena watched as they worked to stabilize Marcus for transport. Both of his forearms were completely shattered, the bones broken in multiple places. The injuries were severe enough that even with surgery, he would never have full use of his hands again. Jesus Christ! One of the paramedics muttered as he worked to immobilize Marcus's arms. What did she hit him with? A baseball bat? Wooden spoon, Sarah said helpfully. Several wooden spoons, actually. They were the most effective tools available. Elena stared at Sarah in disbelief. You did this with kitchen utensils? My instructor always taught us to use whatever was available, Sarah replied. The weapon doesn't matter as much as knowing where to hit and how to hit effectively. As the paramedics loaded Marcus onto a stretcher, Elena found herself in an unusual position. Clearly, a serious assault had taken place, but the traditional roles of victim and perpetrator seemed reversed. Sarah had obvious injuries from being struck, but Marcus's injuries were far more severe and clearly the result of a sustained methodical attack. Mrs. Tredignan Martinez, Elena said carefully, I need to inform you that you're under arrest for aggravated assault. Sarah nodded as if she had been expecting this. I understand. Am I allowed to call my mother? The booking process at the county jail was surreal. Sarah answered every question politely and completely, provided her fingerprints without complaint, and seemed genuinely concerned about when she might be able to return to work. She showed no remorse for what she had done, but also no satisfaction or pride. She treated the entire experience like an unfortunate but necessary business transaction. Her mother, Maria Martinez, arrived at the jail within 2 hours, accompanied by a lawyer named David Hernandez, who specialized in domestic violence cases. Maria took one look at the bruise on her daughter's face and nodded grimly, as if everything suddenly made perfect sense. Did he hit you first? Maria asked in Spanish. Yes, Mama. Sarah replied in the same language, and he threatened to kill me. Maria's expression hardened. Then you did what you had to do. Attorney Hernandez spent an hour with Sarah, going over the details of the case and preparing her defense strategy. What he discovered was that Sarah Martinez had an impeccable record. No prior arrests, steady employment history, and character witnesses who would testify to her nonviolent nature. More importantly, she had documented evidence of Marcus's escalating abuse, text messages to her sister describing his verbal attacks, photos she had secretly taken of holes he had punched in walls, and testimony from co-workers who had noticed her increasing isolation and anxiety over the past several months. This is clearly a case of domestic violence self-defense, Hernandez told the district attorney during plea negotiations. My client was struck first, threatened with death, and responded with force to protect herself from imminent harm. But the district attorney, Rebecca Walsh, wasn't convinced. Mr. Hernandez, your client broke both of her husband's arms with deliberate, systematic violence. This goes far beyond reasonable self-defense. She essentially tortured him. After he struck her and threatened to kill her, Hernandez countered. Martinez genuinely believed her life was in danger, and she acted to neutralize that threat permanently. The case attracted significant media attention, particularly from women's rights groups, who rallied around Sarah as a symbol of fighting back against domestic violence. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse with signs reading, "Self-defense is not a crime," and "How many times should she have let him hit her?" But there were also voices calling for Sarah to face full prosecution for what they saw as excessive and premeditated violence. The debate split along predictable lines, with some viewing Sarah as a hero and others seeing her as a dangerous vigilante. Marcus, meanwhile, underwent multiple surgeries to repair his shattered arms. The doctors were able to set the bones and insert metal plates and screws, but the damage to his nerves and tendons was extensive. He would regain perhaps 60% of normal function, and chronic pain would be a permanent part of his life. During his recovery, Marcus gave several interviews to local news stations, painting himself as the victim of an unprovoked attack by his mentally unstable wife. He admitted to slapping Sarah, but claimed it was a momentary loss of control, not the beginning of a pattern of escalating violence. "I never would have seriously hurt her," Marcus told one reporter. "It was one slap and she turned it into attempted murder. Look at my arms, I'll never be able to work construction again. My life is ruined." But Marcus's version of events began to fall apart when investigators dug deeper into the couple's history. They discovered a police report from 2 months earlier when neighbors had called about loud arguments and what sounded like furniture being thrown. They found medical records showing that Sarah had been treated for stress-related symptoms, including insomnia and anxiety. Most damaging of all, they found video footage from the security camera at Sarah's diner showing her arriving at work with suspicious bruises on several occasions. When confronted with this evidence, Marcus's lawyer advised him to stop giving interviews. The trial began 6 months after the incident. The prosecution argued that while Sarah may have been initially acting in self-defense, she had crossed the line into criminal assault when she tied Marcus up and systematically broke his arms. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Prosecutor Walsh said in her opening statement, "no one disputes that Marcus Martinez struck his wife first, but the question before you is whether the defendant's response was reasonable and proportional to the threat she faced." Defense attorney Hernandez took a different approach. He argued that Sarah's actions, while extreme, were the result of prolonged psychological abuse and a reasonable fear for her life. Sarah Martinez spent 3 years walking on eggshells trying to manage her husband's temper and keep their family together, Hernandez told the jury. On the night in question, Marcus escalated from verbal abuse to physical violence and death threats. "My client had every reason to believe that if she didn't stop him permanently, he would eventually make good on those threats." The most powerful testimony came from Dr. TX. Patricia Williams, an expert on domestic violence who explained the psychological effects of long-term abuse. Victims of domestic violence live in a state of constant hypervigilance. Dr. Williams testified. They learn to read their abuser's moods and reactions with survival-level intensity. When Mrs. Martinez heard her husband threaten to kill her, she wasn't overreacting to empty words. She was responding to a credible threat from someone who had already demonstrated his willingness to use violence against her. Sarah's testimony on her own behalf was calm, detailed, and devastating. She walked the jury through 3 years of escalating emotional abuse, describing how Marcus had systematically isolated her from friends and family, controlled their finances, and created an atmosphere of fear in their home. "He didn't start hitting me that night," Sarah explained. "He started destroying my self-worth from the moment we got married. The physical violence was just the final step in a process that had been going on for years." When asked why she had continued hitting Marcus after he was down, Sarah's answer was simple and direct. "Because I knew that if I didn't stop him completely, he would find a way to hurt me worse later. Men like Marcus don't learn from being shown mercy. They learn from being shown consequences." The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning their verdict, guilty of assault in the 3rd degree, but not guilty of the more serious charges of aggravated assault or attempted murder. They clearly believed that Sarah had been defending herself, but felt that her response had been more extreme than necessary. Sarah was sentenced to 18 months in prison, with the possibility of parole after 9 months. It was a compromise verdict that satisfied no one completely but reflected the complex nature of the case. At her sentencing, Sarah was given the opportunity to address the court. She stood calmly at the defendant's table and spoke directly to Judge Martinez. "No relation." "Your Honor, I don't regret what I did," Sarah said quietly. "I regret that it was necessary, but I don't regret protecting myself from someone who had threatened to kill me. If I had to do it again, I would make the same choice." Judge Martinez nodded solemnly before delivering the sentence. Mrs. AKRS. "Martinez, this court recognizes that you were the victim of domestic violence and that you acted in fear for your life. However, the law requires that self-defense be proportional to the threat faced. Your actions, while understandable, exceeded what the law allows." Sarah served 11 months of her sentence before being released on parole for good behavior. During her time in prison, she received hundreds of letters from women around the country who saw her as an inspiration, as someone who had finally fought back against an abuser and won. Marcus, meanwhile, struggled to adapt to his new limitations. His construction career was over, and chronic pain made even simple tasks difficult. He moved back in with his mother and began drinking heavily, cycling through a series of girlfriends who inevitably left when they saw how he treated them. But something interesting happened in those relationships. Word had gotten around about what had happened with Sarah, and the women Marcus dated knew his history. When he raised his voice or showed signs of controlling behavior, they didn't try to placate him or make excuses. They left. Marcus discovered that his reputation preceded him everywhere he went. Employers were reluctant to hire him, knowing about his domestic violence history. Women were wary of dating him. Even casual acquaintances treated him with suspicion. The permanent damage to his arms served as a constant reminder of the night he had pushed Sarah too far. But the damage to his reputation was arguably worse. In a strange way, Sarah had achieved exactly what she had intended. She had made it impossible for Marcus to hurt another woman. Sarah, meanwhile, rebuilt her life from the ground up. She moved back in with her mother temporarily, then found a small apartment across town and returned to work at the diner. Her coworkers and regular customers welcomed her back with overwhelming support, and she discovered that her reputation as someone who wouldn't be pushed around actually made her feel safer in the world. Men who might have otherwise bothered her thought twice about approaching aggressively. Her story had spread throughout the neighborhood, and everyone knew that Sarah Martinez was not a woman to be trifled with. 2 years after her release from prison, Sarah met David Chen Jr., the son of her old martial arts instructor. David was a social worker who specialized in helping domestic violence survivors, and he understood both her strength and her vulnerability. Their relationship developed slowly, built on mutual respect and genuine affection, rather than the intensity and drama that had characterized her marriage to Marcus. Sarah never married again, but she lived a full and satisfying life surrounded by friends and family who respected her courage. She became an advocate for other domestic violence survivors, teaching self-defense classes and speaking at shelters about the importance of fighting back against abuse. Years later, when people would ask Sarah if she regretted what she had done that night in the kitchen, her answer was always the same: "I regret that Marcus forced me to become someone capable of that kind of violence. But I don't regret protecting myself, and I don't regret making sure he could never hurt another woman the way he hurt me." The story of Sarah Martinez became a legend in her neighborhood, passed down from mothers to daughters as a cautionary tale about the consequences of underestimating women. It was a story about the moment when someone who had been pushed too far finally pushed back, with devastating and permanent results. But most of all, it was a story about a woman who refused to be a victim, even when that refusal required her to become something she had never imagined she could be. In the end, perhaps that was the most important lesson of all, that ordinary people, when pushed beyond their limits, are capable of extraordinary things. And sometimes those extraordinary things change not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone around them. Sarah Martinez never hit anyone again after that night, but she never had to, as if the world had learned to treat her with respect, and she had learned that she was strong enough to demand that respect. That, more than any revenge or punishment, was her true victory.